My presentation is about doing graphic geographies as a method of research in urban and literary and narrative geographies. So I'm a cultural geographer working at the University of Padova. I don't know how many people of you know Padova. It's a middle-sized town close to Venice in the northeastern part of Italy. And I'm teaching here as well, and I'm teaching cultural and literary geography, and also creative communication and landscape storytelling to master's students in landscape studies. My background is in literary studies, and then I turned to geography during my PhD. So I can imagine that we have like PhD students and students and people from different ages. So that was my kind of interdisciplinary process. And this kind of interdisciplinary background is also the reason why I'm working in an interdisciplinary way as a geographer. I'm currently also the director of the Museum of Geography of the University of Padova. And this evening, that might be the reason why I did such a mess, is we have a huge opening of an exhibition that I created. So it's part of my work. This is what we call third mission here in Italy, which means public engagement, I would say, and dissemination of our research outputs among a non-academic audience. My research lines are connected to mostly narrative geographies, which means literary representations of cities in contemporary novels. But then I've turned my attention also towards comic-based research. So studying how comics represent cities, but also how we can conduct research using comics. So geography and comics are connected in many different ways. On the one hand, you can read comics and find there are some interesting ways to represent spaces, places, or other topics of geographical interest. As a geographer, you can also choose to work together with comic authors, for example, to translate your own research in a comic book, which is something that is happening more and more lately. So it's increasingly present, the idea of collaborating with artists and comic authors as well to translate our research into an apparently easier, or at least more accessible way. This means that probably a non-academic audience wouldn't like open a typical academic book, but a non-academic audience would probably be more keen to read a comic book that is about the topic of our research. But what I'm doing is more connected to the idea of using, as I said, comics as a research practice. And I'm a comic author myself. So what I'm going to do today is probably just like present part of my research, but show you some of the works that I've been doing so far that probably are nicely connecting with what you're speaking about in this seminar series. This is the boring academic book, which I've tried to explain what I was telling you before. So it's titled Comics as a Research Practice, Drawing Narrative Geographies Beyond the Frame. And in the different chapters of this book, I've tried first to trace a very short history of the relationship between geography and comics, and then draw the different theoretical lines that inform my research. And then I have a second part of the book that is focused on different case studies that are those that I'm going to speak to you about now. These are the different geographic, I would say it's geographical, but also graphic. So it's geographic in this sense. So the creative outputs of my research that I've done so far. This one here is called La geografia spiegata ai bambini. So basically it's geography explained to children, and it's an illustrated book for kids around 8 years old. And it's let's say a funny way to rethink the very complicated concepts that we discuss as geographers, like place, space, but also cartography, maps, environmental change and climate change, through the perspective of young children. And so this is one of the projects that I loved the most. But today I'm going to, and this is the latest one. I've collaborated with the Royal College Museum, the Royal College of London, about this project, which is called Music Migration Mobility. And it's about musicians that moved to the UK, to the United Kingdom during Second World War to find a place to stay during the Nazi time, because they were mostly of Jewish origins. But the projects that I'm going to quickly present to you today are quartieri, which is the Italian name for neighborhood. I don't know how you call quartieri, what is the word in Portuguese. But I don't know what's Carlos, what is the name of quartieri in
Bairro.
Bairro, okay. And the subtitle is Viaggio al centro delle periferie italiane, which is a kind of play on words to say that we travel at the center of peripheries, of Italian peripheries. So it's a kind of way to deconstruct the idea of peripherality, putting these marginal neighborhoods at the center of our research. And the other project that I'm going to quickly present, it's Lines. And if you're going to be interested in reading a copy of Lines, I would be really happy to share it with you. Maybe I can share it also in the chat once I'm done with my presentation. So it's open access, and I would love you to have your feedbacks. And it's based in a city called Turku in Finland, but I'm going to come back to this later on. So I'm going to present this first example, which is about urban comics. As you know, there is a kind of nice connection between comics and cities. On the one hand, many scholars working in comic studies affirm that basically the graphic novel as a genre was born in the city, and because of the shape of the metropolis of the end of the 20th century. So basically there is also a kind of structural interconnection between how comics work and how cities are built, in the case that we have a kind of connection between the small units by which comics are made, the panel, the layout of the page, etc., and the way in which we build cities through blocks, for example. In this project, which is called Quartieri, we basically worked with starting from this idea, which is how can we actually tell the stories of peripheral neighborhoods beyond stereotypes? I can, so I don't know, but I can imagine that also in Brazil, you have this kind of stereotypical representation in the media, for example, of peripheral areas and neighborhoods in the cities. This happens mostly all around the world, and it's the same also in Italy. So the idea that we wanted to deconstruct was to think about these peripheral neighborhoods as places that are also kind of laboratories where different ways by which we can think about the cities start to happen. So they are also places of experimentation of new ways to build communities and informal communities and ways of living and sharing together. So what we did was to organize it not as a single graphic novel, but as a collection of stories. So it's a kind of comic book anthology with 5 chapters, and each chapter is about one city, and more specifically about one specific neighborhood in one city. So we have different cities of different sizes. Some of them may be already known by you, and others may sound completely new. So we have Milano, Bologna, Roma, Palermo, and Padova, the city where I come. Actually, it's not the city where I come from, but the city from where I'm speaking to you today and where I work, as I said. So in each city, we had a kind of group of researchers that were already conducting their research there for a long time. Let's say some of them have been working there for more than 10 years with as a kind of researchers and activists, with many laboratories and places where they work together with the associations and citizens who live in these specific areas of their cities. So we created this kind of anthology to share our different experiences. Of course, Padova, Bologna, Roma, Milano, Palermo are quite different cities, not in terms of the size, but also in terms of what happens there, the difficulties that citizens have. But what we shared from the very beginning was, on the one hand, the stereotypical representation of peripheral neighborhoods, which was quite the same in the different cities, and also our idea to collect the stories by the inhabitants. How did we collect these stories? We did it in the case of me and Adriano Cancellieri, who was my colleague who worked with me in Padua. We chose to work by collecting stories through walking. So we used walking not only as an observational tool and just a way to move around the neighborhood, but it was also a methodology by which we were conducting interviews. Our idea was that we could walk with people, walk with our interviewees, and ask them just a very simple question at the beginning, which was, can you lead us or guide us to your favorite place in the neighborhood? So from there, basically, every time we were meeting someone else, we didn't know where we would have gone that day. So basically, we were just like, as you know, conducting research can sometimes be also a process of power, where researchers kind of decide what to ask and how to lead the conversation with the interviewees. In this case, what we wanted to do was to be guided by the people that were living in the neighborhood. And this worked quite well. In this case, we have Samrat, who guided us to his favorite place in the neighborhood. And while walking, we, on the one hand, we came to know each other better, but at the same time, we came to visit the neighborhood through the gaze of other people. And it was easier for us to deconstruct our preconceived ideas about what to find in the neighborhood. Once the book and the comic book was published, the first presentation was, of course, in a bookshop, which is a tiny bookshop that you can see in this picture here in the neighborhood. And it was kind of a success because people were keen to see a different representation of the place where they live. and it was interesting to collect more stories, and also, as you can see here, to bring the printed copies of the book, so the output of our research, to the people that we had the opportunity and chance to interview during our research process. It was kind of a very emotional moment in which someone was really laughing loud and someone else was even crying, and it was really one of the best moments of my life as a researcher. So this was the first example that I presented, which was based in the city where I'm actually living and working. The second project that I would like to present to you before I end my presentation is based in a completely different city and in a completely different project as well. The city is called Turku, and I don't know if you know Turku. Basically, I didn't know either where it was before I started collaborating with people there. It's a middle-sized city in Finland, but it was actually the capital city before Helsinki. So it has a long story, Turku, and it was also the first city in Finland who had a tramway. As you can say, okay, why is this important and why should I be interested in this information? The project was in which I was involved was called Put Space, Public Transport as Public Space, and was an international project that was trying to read public space through the lens of public transport. And it was particularly important. So they had cities in Estonia, cities in Germany, and cities in Finland, and cities around Europe more in general. And what they were trying to do was to see how much public transport, on the one hand, impacted the way in which cities were lived, but also the way in which cities were imagined. And this is the reason why the information that I gave you before about the fact that Turku had the first tram in Finland is now important, because when they had the opening of the tramway in Turku, it was the beginning of the 20th century, and it was a kind of symbol of progress and modernity. So in the imaginary of the city, the moment in which the tram was opened in Turku was the moment in which Turku was mostly important during its own history as a city. What happened to the tram? Of course, as in many other cities, when cars after the Second World War became the main transport for private transport, trams started to become old-fashioned and too slow to be used by citizens, and slowly they were kind of closed until 1972, when the tramway was completely stopped in Turku and it stopped its operations. So you would say, another question is, why are you speaking about the tram which closed almost 50 years ago? Because even though the tram closed 50 years ago, many people, especially people interested in environmental justice and sustainability in the city, are claiming for the comeback of the tram in Turku. So there is a kind of discussion about the idea of having the tram back in the city of Turku in the near future, to promote a more sustainable way to move across the city. And on the other hand, as I said, the moment in which the tram was there is kind of represented and stick in the memories of the citizens of Turku as a kind of golden age of the city. And therefore, if you go and visit Turku, you will find at each corner of the street postcards with the tram on it. So basically, what I did was to conduct research. As you can see here, they have many postcards with different trams in the different eras of the trams. So trams from the 50s, from the 60s, but also from the 40s during the war, the tram during fall or during winter with the snow, etc., etc. So what I did at the beginning was trying to collect as many visual materials as possible to represent this kind of imaginary connected to the city. And then, of course, I also visited the archive, the city archive of Turku, and worked with archivists to collect some visual materials that would help me to imagine how the city was in the past. Because as you can imagine, it's easy to represent a city in comics if it's a contemporary city, right? I just go on the street, take pictures, see what I see, and then draw on the page what I've seen. But it's much more complicated when I have to draw comics that are set in the past, because how can I imagine and know the way in which Turku was, for example, in the 30s, in 1930s, for example. So that's the reason why I had also to enter the archive. And I had also the opportunity to visit the very, as you can see, very destroyed and old, rusted vehicles that are still preserved. So this is one of the latest trams that were operating that is still preserved at the huge archive of the Museum of Turku. Then I started to visit the archive searching for objects. This was, for example, the uniform of a woman who used to work for public transport in Turku for like 30 years or something like this. So each object was able to tell a very interesting and also intimate story about people using the tram and so on. So this is the result, a series of representations and comic pages in which you can see there are some of the objects that I found in the archive, but also the reconstructions of some images during the past, but also excerpts from interviews that I conducted with people living in Turku in 2020. It was just before the pandemic. So I was there in January and then I came back, and then COVID-19 came out. So it was really like the last long travel I did before the pandemic started. So these are the beautiful women that I interviewed in Turku in 2020. And these are some of the pages that came out. These are some of the practices that I conducted, like using my own body as a way to perceive urban space and to represent it and to collect materials. This is one of the maps that we used to perform the old tramways in the contemporary cities. And the idea was also to compare all the tramways and tram lines with contemporary lines in the city, which are mostly bus lines of public transport. I use also colors as a narrative thread. So what I used was yellow. As you can see, many of these pages have a yellow color that comes out. I used yellow because yellow was the color of the trams back in the past, but is also the symbolic color of public transport in Turku today. And this is just a bus stop with a long story. And that's it, basically. This is the end, the final page of my comic book. So this is also the end of my presentation. And I hope it was possible for you to connect some of the things that I mentioned with what you discussed like earlier. So sorry. And in general, with the things that you are discussing in this beautiful seminar series, I can see that it's also like opening a very huge world, which is connected to doing creative research, doing comics, and so on. So I hope that you had the chance to connect it with something that is interesting for you. But I'm happy to answer questions if you have any.